The quiet rebel who changed corporate strategy forever. It didn't start with a speech, a scandal, or a sweeping corporate mandate. It started with a single employee who refused to follow a script everyone else accepted. A quiet rebel, someone who challenged the rules not with noise, but with clarity, set off a shift that would eventually rewrite how companies thought about strategy itself. To understand why this story still shapes modern business, we need to return to a moment when the corporation in question stood proudly at the top of its industry. Growth was steady, profits were reliable, every decision flowed through a familiar pipeline of committees and forecasts. But beneath that sense of order lay a growing problem. The company had stopped listening. It moved by inertia, relying on strategies built for a world that no longer existed. Our story begins in one of the most overlooked corners of the organization, a mid-level department responsible for tasks executives barely reviewed. It was there that the quiet rebel worked, observing a growing disconnect between the company's grand plans and the reality unfolding in the market. Reports were filtered, data was massaged, decisions were made to protect narratives rather than discover truth. The company wasn't strategizing, it was performing. Then came the moment that changed everything. During an internal planning cycle, employees were told to produce projections that aligned with leadership's predetermined goals. Most complied. Fighting the system seemed pointless. But the quiet rebel couldn't accept a future built on numbers designed to please rather than inform. Instead of adjusting the data, they built a separate model, one built on unfiltered signals from the market, raw customer behavior, and early indicators others had ignored. The model revealed a storm approaching, declining loyalty, emerging competitors, shifting expectations, patterns that contradicted every rosy forecast leadership celebrated. It wasn't a prediction of mild turbulence. It was a warning of structural change. At first, the rebel kept the model private, unsure how to share something that challenged the company's entire worldview. But the more they refined it, the clearer the message became. If the company continued along its current path, it would hit a wall no amount of branding or cost-cutting could avoid. And so, the rebel made a choice. One that would push them into the center of a transformation they never intended to lead. They shared the model with a small group of colleagues who were stunned by what they saw. For the first time, someone had mapped the reality they all suspected, but never dared to express. What none of them knew was that this quiet act of honesty would ignite a chain of events that would expose hidden flaws in the company's strategy and force its leaders to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. The small group who saw the rebels' model felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief, because someone had finally articulated the unease they'd carried for years. Fear, because the truth inside those numbers contradicted the narrative leadership relied on to maintain stability. Still, the group agreed on one thing. The model couldn't stay hidden. It had to reach someone with the authority to act. But bringing uncomfortable truth to the surface inside a successful corporation is never simple. The first manager who reviewed the findings dismissed them within minutes. They insisted the data set was too narrow, the interpretation too pessimistic, the conclusions too disruptive. "We can't send this upstairs," they warned. "It'll look like we don't trust our own strategy." The message was clear: conform or stay silent. The rebel refused both options. Instead of retreating, they expanded the model. They layered in external market indicators, emerging trends, and risk assessments sourced from analysts the company had ignored. Every pass through the numbers sharpened the message. The storm ahead wasn't hypothetical. It was already forming. And the longer the company clung to its outdated assumptions, the harder the impact would be. As tension grew inside the department, word of the model spread quietly through informal channels. Employees from other teams asked to see it. Some came out of curiosity, others out of worry. Each new pair of eyes confirmed the same unsettling truth. The company's strategy, though stable on paper, was drifting farther from the reality unfolding beyond its walls. Pressure built as the model gained believers. A senior analyst, known for their careful neutrality, reviewed the predictions and found them undeniable. In private, they admitted that leadership had been rejecting warnings for years, choosing optimism over analysis. The corporation had grown so accustomed to success that it no longer recognized risk when it stared directly at it. Meanwhile, departments downstream from key strategic decisions felt the consequences firsthand. Customer churn increased. Competitors stole segments the company once took for granted. Internal workflows slowed under the weight of outdated processes. But none of these issues appeared in leadership presentations. The official narrative remained pristine. The rebels' model threatened that narrative. And soon enough, the threat was noticed. A director summoned the rebel for a meeting. The tone was polite, almost gentle. They asked for an explanation. Why build an unofficial model? Why challenge established forecasts? Why risk destabilizing the planning cycle? But beneath the calm questions lay a deeper tension. The rebel sensed it. The company didn't want truth. It wanted alignment. What happened next changed everything. The director, after reviewing the data in full, didn't shut the project down. Instead, they quietly instructed the rebel to refine the model further and prepare a version suitable for senior leadership, one that could withstand scrutiny from the most resistant voices in the company. It was a turning point. For the first time, the truth had found an ally. But as the model moved closer to the top of the organization, the stakes grew higher than ever, and the forces seeking to protect the old strategy were preparing their own quiet countermove. The pushback began the moment the model reached the upper layers of leadership. Executives who had spent years defending the existing strategy saw the numbers not as insight, but as an attack. They questioned the methodology, dismissed the projections, and accused the rebel of misunderstanding the company's long-term vision. Some even insinuated that highlighting risk during a profitable quarter was irresponsible, an unnecessary disruption to investor confidence. Behind closed doors, alliances solidified. Leaders who had built their reputations on the current strategy felt threatened by anything that hinted at structural flaws. They feared that if the model gained credibility, so would the idea that their oversight had allowed those flaws to grow unchecked. Across meeting rooms and email threads, a quiet resistance formed, one determined to protect the status quo at any cost. Yet the director who supported the rebel refused to back down. They recognized that the company's success had become a trap. It rewarded predictability, punished dissent, and encouraged a culture where inconvenient truths were softened until they were unrecognizable. The director arranged a formal review session, a high-stakes meeting where the rebel would need to defend the model before a table full of skeptical executives. Preparing for the session consumed days. The rebel rewrote their analysis repeatedly, anticipating every question, every challenge, every attempt to undermine the findings. Doubt crept in late at night. Not about the data, but about the consequences. Would speaking honestly jeopardize their career? Would leadership retaliate? Would the truth matter at all? When the meeting finally began, the tension in the room was palpable. Executives sat with arms crossed, ready to dismantle the model point by point. But as the rebel walked through the data, calmly, methodically, without exaggeration, the resistance found fewer places to hide. Trends aligned too perfectly. Warning signs matched patterns seen in companies that had collapsed in previous decades. Every attempt to dismiss the findings was countered by evidence impossible to ignore. Still, conflict ignited. One executive accused the rebel of cherry-picking data. Another criticized the focus on emerging competitors, calling them irrelevant distractions. A third questioned whether the model accounted for the company's brand strength, as if reputation alone could fend off disruption. Each challenge landed like a blow, but the rebel held their ground, responding with clarity and refusing to dilute the message. Gradually, the tone shifted. Not because the executives suddenly welcomed the truth, but because reality outside the boardroom was beginning to align with the rebels' warnings. Key customers were leaving. Competitors were accelerating. Forecasts that once painted a smooth future now showed subtle but undeniable declines. The model wasn't radical, it was accurate. But the most pivotal shift came from someone no one expected, an executive known for their unwavering loyalty to the old strategy. After a long silence, they acknowledged a painful reality. The company had spent years protecting a narrative rather than confronting market change. The rebels' model wasn't the threat. Ignoring it was. The admission cracked the resistance. For the first time, executives asked not how to discredit the model, but how to adapt to it. What began as a confrontation transformed into the early blueprint of a new direction. But the battle was far from over. The model's implications stretched far beyond strategy decks and financial forecasts. If leadership embraced it fully, the company would need to rebuild, restructure, and reimagine itself from the inside out. And not everyone was prepared to face what that transformation demanded. The next phase would test not the rebels' numbers, but the company's courage. The executive team reconvened 1 week later, this time without the posturing that had defined their earlier sessions. The rebels' model had continued spreading through the company, shared quietly among teams who saw in it a reflection of their daily struggles. Pressure mounted from every direction. Customers demanding change, employees craving direction, and the market revealing cracks too deep to ignore. The story had shifted. The question was no longer whether the model was right, but whether the company would act before the window for change closed. As the meeting opened, the director who had supported the rebel presented a stark truth. Hesitation was now the greatest risk. The company had reached a crossroads. To protect its future, it needed a strategy grounded in reality, not reputation. Silence settled over the room. For the first time, executives were not being asked to defend the past. They were being asked to imagine a future that required letting it go. The rebel, seated near the back, watched the discussion unfold. They had no desire for credit, no ambition for the spotlight. Their only goal was to prevent the company from drifting into a decline everyone else was too afraid to name. And slowly, as executives debated the next steps, something remarkable happened. Leadership began acknowledging problems they had long dismissed: outdated processes, inflated projections, cultural rigidity, blind spots in their understanding of customers. The truth, once unwelcome, had become undeniable. The climax arrived when the CEO, a figure known for measured optimism, stood to speak. They admitted the company's strategy had lost touch with the world it served. They acknowledged that the rebels' model had exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. And then, in a rare moment of candor, they committed to rebuilding the strategy from the ground up, guided not by assumption, but by truth. The decision sent ripple effects through the organization. A transformation team was formed. Old metrics were rewritten. Projects once prioritized for optics were scrapped entirely. Teams were empowered to challenge ideas, not preserve them. The rebels' model became the blueprint for a new strategic direction, one that recognized change not as a threat, but as a signal. The cultural shift was not immediate. Some employees clung to familiar routines. Some managers struggled to adapt. But as new initiatives launched, customers responded. Markets stabilized. Innovation returned to conversations that had once been dominated by caution. For the first time in years, the company felt alive, lean, curious, and responsive. In the months that followed, the rebel was promoted, not for being right, but for daring to speak when silence was easier. Yet they remained the same quiet presence in the room, still listening, still questioning, still refusing to let comfort cloud clarity. Their influence didn't come from authority. It came from a refusal to accept a script that no longer fit the world. Looking back, the company realized the transformation had begun long before the strategy reset. It began the moment one employee chose truth over convenience, one model over complacency, one act of quiet rebellion over the safety of following the crowd. Sometimes the future is rewritten not by force, but by someone who simply refuses to look away. In the next episode, we'll uncover the modern version of this story. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The